Tori is a manga series by Osamu Tezuka, or more specifically, 3 different incarnations of a manga series. First, there's the 1954 to 1955 run in Manga Shonen that only lasted for 1 volume's worth of chapters. Not long after that, there was a similarly short-lived 1956 to 1957 run in Shoujo Club. And the third run is what someone is almost certainly going to be referring to if they're talking about Tori. First serialized in the January 1967 issue of Com magazine and moving from manga magazine to manga magazine over the course of about 2 decades until Tezuka's passing. Osamu Tezuka is a more interesting figure than the vague, oversimplified idea of the guy who created anime that an English speaker unfamiliar with his work is likely going to see him as. Something that jumped out at me while reading all of Astro Boy semi-recently due to its relation to another series as well as its general historical significance is seeing how a series that lasted that long is going to have to try to keep up with changing times. In the volume release, certain storylines get these little intros where Tezuka explains the real-world significance of them, and one of them for a story from 1965 goes into how his editors wanted him to make Astro Boy into a darker and more violent character. The arc this is for is one where he temporarily sides with a character who looks straight at the camera and explains how much they love Israel. I wonder what Tezuka meant by that. Sometime in the mid-60s, the combination of politically radical youth movements and creators wanting to push the medium forward resulted in a demand for darker and more complex stories. And while Tezuka would regret the direction he tried to take Astro Boy in and generally be pretty dismissive of the protests of his time, you can see how a lot of his later work attempts to meet this demand. Dororo is rooted in cynicism towards an often romanticized era of history, Blackjack follows a shadier protagonist, and so on. Tori is no exception and is what many would consider Tezuka's magnum opus. Tori is an anthology series, flipping back and forth between past storylines rooted in Japanese history and future storylines that each have their own distinct brand of sci-fi. The main constant in all these different stories is the titular Tori, a personification of abstract cosmic forces as a female bird of fire with a bright glow and blood that's capable of granting immortality. While the English translation refers to this entity as a phoenix, it's more accurate to see it as an amalgam of various different mythological birds, taking most heavily from the Feng Wang of various Asian cultures, which is why I've been referring to both the series and the entity by its Japanese name. The Tori's role varies from arc to arc, sometimes being a neutral observer, other times actively helping humans it deems worthy, and sometimes even delivering punishment to those who have committed a great offense. As an anthology series with quite a bit of variance in its setting, Tori is about a lot of things, and hard to briefly summarize for a short YouTube video, but if there's one central idea you can wrap anything around, it's humanity's inherent mortality. How quickly life can be taken, how we can make the most of that limited time, and how attempts to circumvent this mortality go. Immortality is, of course, a major part of Tori's theming, as the titular entity's blood grants a straightforward form of just living forever. This is often portrayed as a curse, whether it's characters' quest for it distracting from what's truly important in life, or the characters who actually received it only ending up with new problems. But Tori is also interested in more abstract forms of immortality. As you'd expect from a story written by a mangaka who would later do a biography of Buddha, Tori is heavily informed by Buddhism. 2 of its arcs, Karma and San, center around the juxtaposition between the positive role of Buddhism on an individual level and the more negative turn it can take on a systemic level. Naturally, reincarnation is often featured in Tori, with Tezuka's star system of treating characters like actors who appear in different roles across different series recontextualized as side characters from one arc, reincarnating their way into other arcs. And there's also the idea of being immortalized by history, which Tori comments on as early as its very first arc, existing to demystify the romanticized founding of Japan, portraying supposedly divine figures as mere mortals and describing the nation as one founded for slaughter. Tori would not only become a popular manga in a broad sense, but popular specifically with those who would go on to create things themselves. In 2006, the Japan Media Arts Festival commemorated 10 years of existence by holding a survey to pick the 100 works of art across different mediums that best represented Japan. Not only was Tori one of the 25 manga chosen for this exhibition, but in an additional top 10 list only seeking responses from people involved in the creation of manga, Tori came in first. As for specific mangakas who were influenced by Tori, a big one is Naoki Urasawa, who frequently cites reading the series in middle school as a factor for his love of manga, and whose 2008 series Billy Bat is his own take on an exploration of humanity through different time periods. There's also Katushiro Otomo, whose most famous work, AKIRA, not only delves into similar abstract cosmic concepts as Tori, but lists Tezuka in the special thanks section of his final volume. And since AKIRA may or may not have the tiniest bit of importance to the history of anime and manga, even placing second in the same survey I mentioned earlier, you can imagine that many other anime, manga, games, etc. would be Tori inspired by proxy. So to actually get to what the title of this video is about, I fully believe that a lot of the storytelling associated with RPGs can be traced back to Tori. The next time you give an RPG 5 stars in backlog because it said life is worth living at the end, you have Tori to thank for that. Let's look at one of the most important games in the history of the genre, Final Fantasy VII. Like Tori, FF7 is often described by both staff working on it and people playing it as a game centered around the theme of life. The life stream, an abstract cosmic force at the center of FF7 that's often personified through the feminine presence of Aerith, is vaguely similar to the titular bird of fire. Let's try another highly regarded RPG, Chrono Trigger. While a time travel story is certainly different from an anthology, you can still see the similarities in both stories centering on the nature of humanity through the framing device of multiple time periods. Chrono Cross, the sequel to Trigger and a game with an understated degree of influence on later RPGs, not only interrogates the nature of humanity to a far greater extent, but also places a great deal of emphasis on reincarnation. And its usage of both an animal-human hybrid as a point of view and a sci-fi dystopia that exists far beyond the protagonist's time is reminiscent of Tori's Sun arc. Xenogears also has reincarnation as a big focus, and the scrap plans to make it a 6-part saga with the two leads reincarnating across various points in time bears a further resemblance to Tori. A friend who I showed this video script brought up the Soulsborne game's usage of ideas like reincarnation and immortality as being similar to my description of Tori. And while I can't truly confirm or deny that due to not wanting to play pathetically easy games for stupid idiot babies, I found out that Sekiro has a one-armed sculptor character who the wiki describes as a reference to Gao from the Karma art, which leads me to believe there's some way to those comparisons. Hey, editing gnome here. I had forgotten about MegaTen. A series that wears its ties to mythology on its sleeve, takes a lot from classic manga, with Devilman being the most obvious example, and literally has a name that translates to reincarnation of the goddess, really should have been one of the first ones that come to mind. Out of the relatively small pool of MegaTens I've played, SMT4 and its sequels stand out the most due to their setting juxtaposing a futuristic Tokyo and a kingdom reminiscent of feudal Japan. There is one mention of Tori on 4A's Japanese website for a column explaining the mythological origins of Sukuna Hikona, though I'm not quite sure if this column's writer, Nobuyuki Shiota, had any involvement in the game itself. A quick glance at 4A's credits roll doesn't yield his name, but GameFAQs lists him as a writer for the game, which could have all sorts of explanations, like Atlas not giving him credit, or GameFAQs confusing his work on this column for work on the game. The inspiration is complicated, and it's hard to confirm or deny which of these games are definitively Tori inspired without any mention of it from staff, which only exists for Chrono Trigger, as you'll see when I get to discussing games that share staff with it. Tori certainly didn't invent ideas like abstract cosmic forces, the nature of humanity, and the criticism of religious institutions and social deities. Any given RPG's similarities to Tori can often be chalked up to being inspired by something that was itself inspired by Tori, or even taken from the same source as it. As an example of the former, Off was a game that I considered as potentially Tori inspired due to Mortis Ghost mentioning it and other Tezuka works on multiple occasions. However, upon asking him about this via email, he stated that he read it after he finished Off, and more so sees the similarities between the two as a result of taking inspiration from manga like AKIRA, which were themselves inspired by Tori. There's also additional complications when we're dealing with something like Tori that takes a lot from philosophical concepts in real-life history and social mythology. As an example, you might not know this, but the recurring Final Fantasy character Gilgamesh is based on the heroic figure Gilgamesh. But also, his design, initial role as a servant to Extaf, and association with bridges all take influence from the warrior monk Benkei, a figure in Japanese folklore who supposedly defeated 999 samurai before losing to Minamoto no Yoshitsune in a duel fought on Goju Bridge and becoming his servant. Benkei is featured in Tori as a major character in the Civil War arc, which causes an interesting conundrum. Because popular depictions of historical figures shape our understanding of said figures, it's difficult to tell what's based directly on a given historical figure and what's based on any number of different depictions of said figure. There's a non-0% chance that Gilgamesh or any other RPG character who makes allusion to Benkei, like Yangus DQA, could be inspired by Tori, but there's no way of knowing for sure. So the general position of this video is not so much all RPGs are 100% taking direct inspiration from Tori, but rather, here's an accessible and influential work that deals with a lot of similar concepts to RPGs, so I think it's reasonable to say that any number of games in the genre were inspired by it. I would liken this to saying that Cloud or Rock were inspired by Guts. As far as I can tell, no one who worked on either character's respective games has commented on the connection, but because of Berserk's wide influence, it's not exactly an unreasonable jump to make. Tori is in a similar boat, although because it has way less of a presence in English-speaking anime spheres than Berserk, the connection isn't as easy to make in those spheres. However, there are two examples of RPGs where I think Hinotori influence is more likely than not, one of which being a singular game and the other being a whole series. The former is the 1994 cult classic Live Alive, a game that, while taking inspiration from all sorts of places due to its nature as an anthology across drastically different genres, is especially defined by its relationship with manga. These 7 main scenarios were done by 7 different manga artists from Shogakukan. Notable examples include Detective Conan mangaka Gosho Aoyama working on Twilight of Edo Japan, Basara and Seven Seeds mangaka Yumi Tamura, whose name you'd recognize if you watched the Collins Manga Rex video once doing Distant Future, and Yoshinori Kobayashi, whose political beliefs make it only fair for me to deny that he ever did anything of significance. And many of these scenarios have nods to classic manga series. Prehistory, for instance, is pretty clearly based on the gag manga First Human Gyatris. I'd also say Near Future having a character named Akira use psychic powers and fight alongside a motorcyclist is the least subtle reference you can make, but the same scenario just copies Mazinger Z's introductory page. And when an interviewer asked director Takashi Takeda about manga he was influenced by, his answers were Devilman and the work of Osamu Tezuka, specifically mentioning the latter's ability to blend serious and comedic elements. I initially did not know about this explicit mention. I was just going to go on a limb and guess that a story about the nature of creation would naturally make reference to a figure important to the history of a medium it has a particular fixation on. But yeah, you can see the sensibilities associated with Tezuka in Live Alive. The plot beat of Distant Future, where one of the main human characters has to get past his distrust of the robot protagonist, is the kind of thing you'd see in Astro Boy. Twilight of Edo Japan's combination of feudal Japanese politics and a sword-wielding protagonist fighting yokai is reminiscent of Dororo. And while Wild West revealed that its protagonist was really a horse possessed by the spirit of Custer's troops is similar to various horse spirit yokai myths, both Dororo and the short story Bamba feature a similar antagonist. The latter even centers the backstory of its respective horse spirit around a different colonialist war, so Tezuka influence is a more likely possibility here than most cases of two things taken from the same myth. So if I were to point to anything in Live Alive that could have taken from Hinotori, it's the general structure. Both stories are anthologies marked by the contrast between drastically different time periods, and both make the main constant an entity that exists on a higher plane of existence, be it the titular Hinotori or the antagonistic Odio. Live Alive also has the recurring joke characters of the Watanabe father-son pair, who are similar to the various reincarnated figures that exist within Hinotori. But above all else, Hinotori and Live Alive both use the framework of various different stories across all of time to explore the nature of humanity. Of course, Live Alive goes in its own direction that takes a particular interest in the nature of storytelling itself, but at the end of the day, it's a game about what the fictional heroes we paint as aspirational say about us as a species. And as for the other big example of RPGs that were likely directly inspired by Hinotori, it's this obscure series that I wouldn't expect even the most seasoned RPG player to know about called Draken Quest. Series creator Yuji Horii has mentioned Osamu Tezuka on multiple occasions. In a 2018 interview with Forbes magazine, Horii discusses his time in the manga industry before Dragon Quest, which naturally results in him mentioning how he started out with Tezuka manga as a kid. In a 2017 interview from a Japanese publication called Entertainment Station that I can't find much information on, Horii cites Tezuka as an influence. He specifically mentions reading The Mysterious Boy as a kid and falling in love with the protagonist's use of time manipulation, something that would become a common element in his work. And finally, in a 2020 Young Gangan interview commemorating the end of the Dragon Quest End of Orodo manga, Horii is asked about manga that influenced him, with Hinotori being one of the titles he lists. Surely enough, you can find many plot elements within Dragon Quest that resemble Hinotori. In Dragon Quest III, you travel around slightly different versions of real-world continents, and the towns you visit generally contain a vignette related to the history and social mythology of their respective real-world locations. For example, the Japan stand-in has a recreation of the Yamato no Orochi myth. One of the main objectives in DQ3 is to hatch an egg containing Ramiya, a bird goddess whose peacock-esque design is a clear reference to the mythological Feng Wang, which brings to mind Hinotori when combined with the game's general structure. In Dragon Quest VIII, Ramiya returns with a new design and the new name Imperia. This new incarnation's glowing appearance and role as a higher power traveling across different worlds is very easy to compare to the Hinotori. Dragon Quest V is similar in structure to Hinotori's Karma arc. This arc's protagonist Gao is first seen as a newborn baby before he almost immediately loses an arm and eye due to his father falling off a cliff and dying while carrying him. From there, Karma follows this protagonist all throughout his life as he is kicked out of his home, becomes a murderous bandit, gets in prison, and devotes himself to the Buddhist faith, among other things. DQ5 is also structured by starting with the protagonist's birth and following the major occurrences in his life in chronological order, with many of those occurrences being similar to the ones Gao experiences. This protagonist watches his own father die at an early age, spends a significant portion of his life doing prison labor, and takes on the role of a sage searching for the hero who can use the legendary sword. A vaguely similar trajectory to Gao's development into a Buddhist monk. But out of all the mainline Dragon Quest VII is the one I'd say takes the most from Tori. The bulk of DQ7's runtime consists of your party using a shrine to visit various points in time to unseal islands cast into darkness. The Super Mario 64's Cub world you enter these islands through causes them to feel isolated from each other, and in turn causes the game to take on a similar anthological structure to Tori. A big similarity between DQ7 and Tori is their fixation on the nature of history. One of the most significant locations in DQ7 is an archaeological dig site, and visiting the present-day versions of islands often reveals inconsistencies between the events that took place and the modern understanding of them. In regards to the latter point, DQ7 scenario's penchant for ending with ironic twists is yet another aspect of it that lines up with Tori. And finally, DQ7's main thematic statement of the game's events serving as a test for humanity to prove itself worthy of existing without the protection of God is in a similar vein to Tori's ruminations on the nature of humanity. And Dragon Quest is fucking Dragon Quest, so if it has any degree of Tori influence, you can say that a bunch of other RPGs have Tori DNA by proxy. The same can be said about anything with AKIRA influence having Tori influence by proxy. Tori is just a really big deal in Japan to the point where its titular entity has a statue in the Kyoto International Manga Museum. But in English-speaking anime/manga spheres, the only way to read it is through a translation that's from the early days where flipping manga to read left to right was still fairly common and also out of print if you prefer to read physically, so this degree of influence is not understood to the same extent. But in spite of the complications with its translation, when I read Tori did a marathoning Urasawa titles and inevitably learning about its significance to him, it quickly made its way onto the list of my favorite manga. If there's one thing to take away from this video, it's to be willing to look into the works of art that inspired your favorites, especially if said works are from a completely different medium. I'm sure if you followed a given RPG series for a while, you've seen someone complain about how X newer entry is too anime, only for the older entries in the series to just be Gundam, Devilman, Fist of the North Star, etc. Art is one of the main ways we communicate with each other as humans, and the mentality of rigidly sticking to one medium you see in gaming spheres especially only ends up limiting the kinds of communication you can engage with. If you like one part of a chain of inspiration, chances are that you're going to click with the other part, or at the very least gain a new appreciation for the part you already like. So get out there and look for interviews, or skim wiki articles, or hold creators at gunpoint and ask them for recommendations.